There's no doubt that over the past couple of years, we've all been facing an epidemic of what's become known as fake news. I think it's become pretty inescapable, from cable news to advertisements to social media to internet posts to newspapers. Everybody can relate to this phenomenon. As far as I'm concerned, I would separate it into a couple of different categories. So the first category would be news stories that are just plain objectively wrong and designed to mislead people. Imagine a completely fake story that comes out saying that UFOs have been spotted in California and aliens are now invading the United States. As of the time of me recording this episode, that is not true objectively. And here's hoping that by the time it gets released, this episode, it's also still not true. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be listening anyway. But the point is, there are stories out there that are just as false as that, and the purpose is to mislead and confuse people. In my opinion, the second category of fake news would be news that is simply propaganda. So there's very little basis in fact. There might be a couple kernels of truth, but for the most part, it's propaganda that's appealing to fear and emotion. I think that everybody can relate to this. Some event happens and then their favorite political pundit puts their own personal spin on things so that they can kind of appeal to their crowd and get more support that way. Lastly, I think that there's another element of fake news that's actually more insidious than the other two factors. And I think that this is the purposeful effort to undermine actual news by eroding the trust that we have as a society in the actual news. So given that the first two categories of fake news that I described happen, and that's something that exists, it turns out that a lot of people will say, any item of news that I don't agree with or any story that doesn't fit my agenda, I'm going to call that fake news. What becomes dangerous about that is that if everybody starts doing that, where any news story that they don't agree with or any news story that they don't personally fit into their agenda, if that just becomes fake, then all of a sudden, nobody's anchored in the facts anymore. No one's anchored in what's actually happening. And that's dangerous. What is frustrating to me about this whole phenomena is not that any of this exists or that it's out of control, but usually the people who are telling you about it are acting as if they just had some earth-shattering new discovery that changes everybody's worldview. A lot of times people will talk about the fake news phenomenon as if they are Galileo or Newton or Einstein discovering some sort of insane scientific theory. Unfortunately for them, this type of stuff has been going on forever. Literally since people started chiseling stuff into clay tablets in Mesopotamia, this stuff has been going on. Governments, news organizations, regular people have all put out fake stuff. They've all put out stuff with a certain bias or agenda, and they've all made efforts to undermine actual news and actual facts on the ground. Let's take World War I, for example. For most of the war, all of the countries involved were involved in propaganda campaigns and press censorship, mostly in order to get morale boosted up, in order to convince enough people to go out and fight in this horrifying war. Let's look at Great Britain, for example. One of the newspapers in London that had millions of readers was publishing stuff like this. Quote, "However the world pretends to divide itself, there are only two divisions in the world today, human beings and Germans." End quote. Imagine dozens of newspapers publishing stuff like that where there's absolutely no basis in reality whatsoever. You're telling me German people aren't human beings? That's just self-evidently ridiculous. But newspapers and governments were very eager to turn this into a good versus evil type of thing. Anything that you can do to dehumanize the enemy, turn this war into a sort of civilizational struggle where the stakes are as high as it gets and losing would result in the end of civilization itself, that's going to boost morale and that's going to get more people to sign up for the war effort. In Britain, a press bureau was formulated to determine what should and should not be published as early as 1914. And many newspapers didn't actually object to this. They saw their role not to report the facts, but to keep morale high, and also to convince the people of the moral correctness of their country's actions. The other thing to keep in mind here is that newspapers were getting information from reporters and things like that, but a lot of times these guys weren't anywhere close to the front lines. Most papers just got their information from official military sources and didn't really question it. Most of the reporters, most of the newspaper people didn't get too close to the front lines. And again, if your objective is just to boost morale and convince everyone that your government is doing the right thing, then it's not important that you actually report the facts. It is important to note that some newspapers were out there publishing dissenting opinions about some of the horrible things that were happening in the war accurately, and efforts were made to kind of cast that newspaper or those people in the light of fake news, which of course is ironic because they're the ones reporting the actual news. Very soon after the start of the war, there was something called the Defense of the Realm Act, which made it illegal to print anything, quote, "of such a nature as is calculated to be or might be directly or indirectly useful to the enemy," end quote. There was a secret war propaganda bureau which was designed to prevent anyone from publishing anything that questioned the heroism of the army or the country, and really was just designed to influence public opinion in a positive way towards the war. Anybody who dissented could be blamed and possibly arrested. They could have their newspaper shut down. But I do think it's important to note that, as we talked about, it wasn't just the governments who were trying to control propaganda and trying to control the narrative. It was also private citizens and private newspapers who felt like their job was to keep morale high and convince people that the war was the correct thing to do. We've been talking mostly about Britain here, but France did very similar things, both the government and private citizens. Germany actually wasn't totally on board with this whole controlling public opinion thing until later in the war, because in an autocratic government like Germany, they didn't really think that public opinion mattered, and nothing the public said or did was going to influence what the military guys at the top were thinking. By the time Ludendorff is running the show in 1917, though, this would change. Here's what he says about propaganda, quote, "Good propaganda must keep well ahead of actual political events. It must act as a pacemaker to policy and mold public opinion without appearing to do so. Before political aims are translated into action, the world has to be convinced of their necessity and moral justification." End quote. One of the things that separated Ludendorff from other generals in World War I was he had a good understanding of modern warfare and modern total war strategy, and that has to include some sort of control for the public opinion factor. So Britain was doing it, France was doing it, Germany was doing it, autocratic Russia was doing it, and even the United States of America was involved in some of this public opinion control, propaganda, and fake news. Go look up the Sedition Act of 1918, where it became essentially illegal to speak or print anything negative about the United States' entry into World War I, or to speak or write anything negative about Woodrow Wilson himself or his policies. Hundreds of people would be prosecuted under this Sedition Act just for speaking their mind. So much for freedom of speech, right? Listen to historian G.J. Meyer talking about the propaganda efforts by all of the countries involved in the Great War, at least in the first 2 years. Quote, "For 2 years, all 3 countries relied primarily on a strict but easily maintained press censorship, often banning publications that refused to cooperate, on assuring their populations that the war was being won, and on depicting the enemy as evil incarnate. Their methods were predictable and, in retrospect, sometimes seem ridiculous. The German storyline was that the Reich was fighting a defensive war against a cabal of unscrupulous enemies determined to destroy it. The British and French followed an exactly opposite script, one in which they were defending civilization against Huns who wanted to rule the world. Even the atrocity stories that were staples in the newspapers of the Entente were mirrored in those of the Central Powers. The Germans were reported to be cutting off the hands of French boys so they could never become soldiers, to be raping children and bayoneting infants. The German public was told that the Russians were poisoning the lakes of East Prussia and cutting off the limbs of captured German soldiers, and that the French and Belgians made a specialty of gouging out prisoners' eyes. Lying was epidemic. Newspapers ran old photographs of Russian pogroms against Jews as evidence of Germany's rape of Belgium, and officials with access to the facts were not immune. David Lloyd George, long before he became prime minister, was declaring in public that, quote, "The new philosophy of Germany is to destroy Christianity," end quote. That's a great summary right there because it talks about all of the elements of fake news that we talked about earlier. So there's stories that are just plain false and ridiculous, like the Russians poisoning those lakes. There's stories that are just propaganda and lies with kind of a kernel of truth, like using the photographs of the pogroms against Jews as evidence for Germany's atrocities that they committed. There's lies by public figures to try and convince people of a certain agenda, like Germany trying to destroy Christianity. That would probably be news for the thousands of Christian German soldiers. And it turns out that when you spread enough propaganda, enough lies, and enough misinformation, it becomes very difficult for the average citizen to determine what's true and what's not. The other thing to pay attention to here is that the stakes are obviously being ramped up to huge levels. I mean, survival itself and survival of the civilization. I mean, imagine losing a war to people who are bayoneting babies or cutting off the hands of little boys or poisoning lakes. So obviously the motivation to keep fighting for a certain segment of the population is going to increase if you believe that you're fighting against horrifying monsters. And if you can ramp up the propaganda to levels that are just beyond reason, what happens if you lose? Or what happens if you win? Well, if you lose, you're going to feel terribly wronged. You're going to feel like you're being ruled by monsters, animals who have it out for you and want to end your civilization. So that's not going to help in the post-war cleanup process. And if you win, you're not going to have any incentive to kind of make a rational effort to be fair to the losers. Again, if they're just horrifying monsters, then there can't really be peace with these monsters who've committed all these supposed horrifying atrocities. To me, it's obvious that the issue of propaganda and using lies to try and motivate people and fake news was obviously an issue in World War I, and it obviously had a hugely negative impact on the war continuing longer than it could have, people at the time not having a full understanding of what was really going on, and these types of things. I do think it's useful to look into this type of thing during World War I and during other times in history, because it does show that the stuff we're going through in the modern day, kind of like I talked about at the beginning of the episode, it's not necessarily new. People have been through it before and they've gotten through it, but obviously they had to learn some important lessons along the way, and you have to be hopeful that we actually did learn the lessons and don't repeat the mistakes. As far as what is the antidote for this type of thing in the modern day, I'm not exactly sure. I don't have all the answers there. If I did, I think I'd be more famous and probably more rich. But during the time of World War I, the antidote was simply the facts of what was happening during the war. There's only so long that you can fool people for before the facts come to the surface. The propaganda at the beginning of the war, talking about war as a glorious thing and all of the huge supposed victories either side was having against the evil monsters who were trying to destroy civilization itself. There was only so long that that narrative could be perpetrated, because eventually the soldiers are going to go home and they're going to tell the story. And eventually, when you tell enough lies, people are going to realize that, hey, wait a second, this isn't adding up. Maybe there's more to the story. The proof is sort of in the pudding here. I'm sitting next to a huge stack of books that all tell the story of World War I. Obviously, not every book or every historian is going to agree, or every soldier who was there is going to agree on the events and exactly what happened, but when you put it all together, you can get a reasonable picture of what actually happened. And obviously, that picture of what happened has no correlation with any of the propaganda and fake news type of stuff that I was mentioning earlier. So if the antidote to lying and propaganda and deception is just time and the facts, you do have to hope that you can avoid too much damage in the process.